They're people who speak about their future with a kind of quiet certainty. They can describe the life that they want in extraordinary detail, the work they will one day do, the money they will one day make, the person they will one day become. And sometimes they are not delusional. They are intelligent enough to imagine it, sensitive enough to feel it, ambitious enough to want it. But the strange part is this: nothing moves. Not really. Months pass, sometimes years. The dream stays vivid, the life stays hypothetical. And from the outside, it looks like laziness. But very often, it is something more private than that. Because some people are not procrastinating a task, they are postponing a collision between who they want to be and who they may have to discover they really are. That is a much deeper fear. And once you see it, a lot of human behavior begins to look different. Because there is a kind of person who does not just love big dreams, they live inside them. The dream is not simply a goal anymore, it becomes a psychological refuge, a place where the self remains untouched, untested, and still full of promise. And that promise can be intoxicating. William James once wrote that human beings are deeply shaped by what they attend to inwardly. And if you pay attention, really pay attention, you begin to notice that imagining a future self can create a powerful emotional experience in the present. Not because anything has changed, but because the mind often responds to vivid possibility as if it were a form of movement. This is why some people talk about change with real emotion. Their body responds, their identity responds. For a moment, their life feels larger, and that moment can become a substitute for action. Not because they are weak, because fantasy can soothe pain that reality has not yet relieved. That is the part people rarely say out loud. Sometimes the dream is not only about achievement, sometimes it is what keeps a person from collapsing into the shame of their current life. If I can still become something, then I am not trapped yet. If my future is still intact, then I have not lost. If I have not started, then I have not failed. And that last one matters more than most people realize, because as long as a dream remains untested, it remains pure. Untouched potential is emotionally easier to love than ordinary effort. A book you have not written can still be brilliant. A career you have not pursued can still be exceptional. A version of you that has not entered the world yet can still feel extraordinary. But the moment you begin, something changes. Reality enters, and reality is never as flattering as imagination. This is where many people get stuck, though they rarely describe it this way. They think they are waiting for the right moment. Because the question is no longer why you have not acted. The question is how much longer you are willing to let the future protect you from the truth of the present. They think they need clarity, discipline, confidence, certainty, a better plan, a better season, a different mood. But underneath all of that, something quieter may be happening. They are protecting the dream from being touched by evidence. Because once action begins, the beautiful imagined self has to meet the actual self. The slower self, the inconsistent self, the self that hesitates, gets tired, produces mediocre first drafts, makes awkward attempts, loses momentum, starts again. And that meeting can feel devastating, not because it proves you are nothing, but because it threatens a story you have been using to survive. Carl Jung believed that one of the hardest things a human being can do is confront themselves without illusion. Not just their darkness, but their limits, their incompleteness, their lack of special exemption from the slow laws of reality. That is what action often forces. Not merely the risk of failure, but the loss of fantasy. And for some people, that loss feels unbearable because they have spent years loving themselves through potential. Potential gave them identity. Potential gave them comfort. Potential gave them a future tense strong enough to quiet the disappointment of the present. So when people say, why don't they just start? They are usually underestimating what starting actually threatens. Starting threatens the private belief that maybe you were meant for more. Starting threatens the emotional shelter of one day. Starting threatens the image of the self that has not yet been contradicted. In that sense, inaction is not always a lack of desire. Sometimes it is self protection. And that is why overthinking can become so seductive. People often describe overthinking as if it were only a cognitive habit. Too many thoughts, too many scenarios, too much analysis. But often overthinking is not just thought, it is delay with dignity. It allows a person to remain in the territory of intelligence instead of entering the territory of exposure. As long as I am still evaluating, refining, considering, preparing, I do not yet have to face the ordinary humiliation of beginning badly. And that humiliation matters. Because the real world does not honor potential the way the mind does. The real world asks for repetition, it asks for boring effort, it asks for work that does not look meaningful at first. It asks you to become visible before you feel ready. And many people are far less afraid of hard work than they are of becoming ordinary inside that process. That is a deeper wound. They do not simply want progress. They want the progress to preserve the feeling of being special. But real growth almost never feels special while it is happening. It feels repetitive, it feels small, it feels unimpressive. It often feels like nothing is changing, even while something is. This is where many ambitious people quietly lose the battle, not because they hate effort, because effort does not resemble the dream. The dream is cinematic, effort is plain. The dream feels like destiny. Effort feels like doing one small thing again when nobody is watching. And if a person is emotionally attached to the image of transformation more than the structure of transformation, they will keep drifting back toward possibility instead of practice. This is why some people become attached not to success, but to the identity of almost starting, almost changing, almost becoming, almost arriving. There is something strangely safe about almost. It hurts, but it does not expose. It disappoints, but it does not destroy the illusion completely. So a person can live for years in this suspended state, speaking in the language of future certainty while privately accumulating present evidence that they do not trust themselves. And that may be the most painful cost of all, because the true damage is not only that the dream stays unrealized, it is that the relationship between the person and themselves begins to erode. When you keep returning to the same imagined future without entering it, something inside you starts to split. There is the self you speak about and the self you keep waking up as. The gap between those two selves becomes a source of shame. At first, it is subtle, then it becomes chronic. You begin to feel tired when you talk about your goals, not because the goals are wrong, but because your nervous system has started associating them with self betrayal. You stop trusting your own excitement. You stop believing your own promises. You become suspicious of your own hope. And that is a very lonely place to live because from the outside, you may still look ambitious, but inside, something has gone dim. Viktor Frankl wrote that when a person cannot find meaning through genuine movement, they begin to suffer in a particular way, not only from pain, but from inner emptiness, from the unbearable tension between what life asks and what the self refuses to face. That tension is everywhere in this pattern. A person is not only avoiding action, they are avoiding grief. The grief of not being instantly who they imagined, the grief of not being exempt from process, the grief of discovering that becoming is slower, humbler, and less glamorous than fantasy promised. And yet, paradoxically, that grief is also the doorway, because nothing real can begin until something unreal is allowed to die. The idealized self, the perfect beginning, the fantasy that clarity will arrive before action, the belief that readiness is something you wait for rather than something you build. Albert Bandura's work on self efficacy showed something profoundly important. Confidence is not usually the cause of action, it is often the result of action. People do not become ready and then move. More often, they move in small ways, and readiness starts forming afterward. But that truth is difficult to accept if you are emotionally invested in the fantasy of a powerful beginning. Because then you have to accept something almost offensive to the ego. You will probably begin as someone far less impressive than the person you imagined. You will begin incomplete, and that is not failure, that is reality. The deeper problem is that many people are not prepared to love themselves inside reality, only inside possibility. So they remain loyal to the future self because the future self has not disappointed them yet. It is still beautiful there, still coherent, still untouched, but untouched things cannot save you. Only lived things can do that. Only attempted things, only imperfect things, only actions that carry the risk of contradiction. So if a person keeps dreaming big and doing nothing, the real question may not be, why are they so lazy? It may be, what illusion are they protecting? Because once you ask that, the whole pattern changes shape. Now, the problem is not productivity, it is identity. It is the secret way the ego can use ambition to avoid transformation. It is the way a person can worship a future self so intensely that they never let a present self begin. And this is where a more honest shift becomes possible, not a motivational shift, not a dramatic reinvention, something quieter than that. A person must stop asking, how do I become the powerful version of myself I keep imagining? And begin asking, can I tolerate being real long enough to become anything at all? That is a harder question, but it is also the first useful one. Because the way out is not to intensify the fantasy, it's to loosen your emotional dependence on it, to stop using the dream as proof that your life still matters, to stop requiring your future self to rescue your present self. to stop treating beginning badly as if it were a verdict on your worth. BJ Fogg's behavior research points towards something simple but psychologically revealing. Change becomes possible when the action is small enough that the mind no longer experiences it as a major internal threat. And that matters here, not because small steps are a cliche, but because for someone trapped in potential, the first real movement must feel survivable to the identity. The point is not to become impressive immediately. The point is to become contactable by reality. One honest action, one visible effort, one small behavior that does not defend the image but serves the life. That is where dignity begins to return, not when the dream gets bigger, when the self becomes less hidden. And maybe that is the most uncomfortable truth in all of this. Some people do not need a bigger vision. They need a less protected one. They need a future that is no longer being used as emotional anesthesia, a dream that no longer exists to preserve self esteem, an ambition that can survive contact with imperfection. Because a dream only becomes meaningful when it is allowed to become human, messy, slow, embarrassingly real. And perhaps that is what so many people have been avoiding. Not effort itself, but the loss of enchantment, the moment when a life stops being imagined and starts being lived. So maybe the question is no longer why some people dream big and do nothing. Maybe the deeper question is this: how long can a person keep using the future to protect themselves from the present before the future itself becomes another form of disappearance? And if that question feels uncomfortably personal, that may be because the mind was never only trying to delay action. It was trying to protect an identity. The tragedy is that what protects the identity can quietly imprison the life. So, in the end, the hardest thing is not starting. It is surrendering the version of yourself that felt special only because reality had never touched it. And maybe that is what real maturity asks of us: not to become fearless, but to become willing to be ordinary long enough for something real to begin. Because the question is no longer why you have not acted. The question is how much longer you are willing to let the future protect you from the truth of the present.